As the Russians retreated from the fields of Berezina, they decided in a council of war that Moscow was not to be held, as the army would be destroyed on second contact with the French. Kutuzov said, "You were afraid of falling back through Moscow, but I consider it the only way of saving the army. Napoleon is a torrent for which we are as yet unable to stem. Moscow will be the sponge that sucks him dry." A hurried evacuation of the city occurred, headed by the mayor of Moscow, Rostopchin. The evacuation is quite interesting. Pretty much all of the elites and civil workers were forced out under Russian fear that they would liaise with the French. They then dismantled 100 water pumps and evacuated the fire brigade. The civilians, about 10,000 from 260,000, remained, and they mostly had to fend for themselves as Moscow was deconstructed around them. On the 15th of September, Napoleon arrived to a city on fire with only 10,000 inhabitants left and set up headquarters in the Kremlin. The fire started at about midday, and by the 16th, Napoleon was forced to move to a palace on the road to the north of Moscow. 3/4 of the city had been destroyed by then. Now, Napoleon's primary objective was to destroy the Russian army. Taking the city was of little importance. But something you might not know, Moscow was not the capital back then, it was St. Petersburg. The history of the country is heavily split between the aristocrats and the peasantry, reflected in the design and importance of the two cities. Moscow was the religious and lower to middle class center of Russia, while St. Petersburg was a city defined by the influence of very high-class European influence, namely the French. Moscow turned into the capital only in 1917, the year of the revolution. In the game Victory and Glory, you have to capture the two cities that are actually able to defeat Russia, and I just think that's kinda cool. Although a heap of the city had burnt to the ground and Napoleon had given strict orders not to loot, the soldiers had found a ton of preserved vegetables, spices, silks, and other toys they could sell in the cells of the city, so everybody there managed to survive in relative comfort despite the lack of bread and meat. Napoleon was still pretty desperate, so he tried to enter into negotiations with the Tsar Alexander. 2/3 of his army had been lost just getting to Moscow, and the concept of overwintering there grew more unfeasible each day. Repeated delegations to the Tsar were ignored, and it took 3 attempts before the Tsar banned all of his generals from receiving any French envoys. Napoleon's delusion that the Tsar would talk to him continued for 4 weeks. His generals had noticed the weather slowly worsening day after day, but the Emperor completely ignored them. They couldn't hold the city, it was basically gone, they couldn't go forward, otherwise they would die. So, by the 14th of October, after a small contingent of his troops died and a large amount of horses froze to death, Napoleon had decided to retreat and leave his failed venture behind him. Alright, let's get one thing straight. You've probably heard the meme about Hitler and Napoleon invading during the winter and all that. It's actually completely false, so it'd be kind of sad if you hadn't guessed that by now. Both of these generals invaded on close to the same dates, it's just that the planning for both of them got stuffed up, leaving Hitler's men trying to reach Moscow in the snow, and Napoleon leaving during it, so we're not entirely sure how the meme came to be. But I think I know the perfect person that can resolve this question.
Hello Internet, and welcome to Behind the Meme. Today
Nope, can't do it. No, 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 no. Anyway, the army, a total of 95,000 men, left Moscow on the 19th of October. A key note here is that there was very little logistical supervision among the troops. Wagons were stuffed with silks and valuables more than food. Some officers did notice, but I wouldn't screw with a bunch of angry French troopers myself. Now, one of the big reasons that Napoleon left the city was that he was nervous about a Russian counterattack. This fear was founded on the 18th at the Battle of Tarutino, and this is where Murat's Southern Cavalry screen was attacked by General Bagovat. The French just narrowly escaped encirclement, losing 4,000 out of 25,000 men, and the Russians lost 1,200 out of 36,000. Bagovat himself was killed by a cannonball in this engagement. The battle forced Napoleon to leave a day earlier than intended. The basic plan was simple: reach Smolensk by diverting southwest to Kaluga and then heading directly west. This was for 2 reasons. The first was to avoid the devastated regions as a result of the initial Russian retreat and scorched earth policy. The second was to spin the movement reports heading back to Europe as something they weren't, meaning the southern movements could be interpreted as a different angle of attack rather than a full-on bug-out. Getting your butt kicked by a bunch of Cossacks and Gopniks is not something Napoleon wanted broadcasted to the European powers. Napoleon's first objective was to hit the town of Kaluga, but to do that he had to reach Maloyaroslavets, and this town was located on the river Luzha with 2 different paths, offering Napoleon the choice to continue to Kaluga or go to Medin. When the Russians heard of the French evacuating Moscow, a Russian corps was ordered to reinforce it on the 23rd. Eugene reached the town the next day, and the battle began. The town changed hands 9 times over the course of the day, and Napoleon himself was nearly captured by a group of Cossacks before he was saved by Guard cavalry. It said he kept a vial of poison on his person from then on in case of capture. A further 6,000 men from Eugene's 4th Corps were lost, but he did manage to secure the town. The problem now was the route to take to Smolensk. They could go south to Kaluga, west of Medin, or north to Mozhaysk, near Berezina. Choosing the worst option available, of course, Napoleon decided to head north, and this was an awful idea. Namely, going back would mean that they had just wasted a week of decent weather. It was already getting nasty, but the worst was yet to come, and they would have to go back to already burnt out towns and seeing their dead buddies all over the fields of Berezina. Out of all the dumb memes, why is this the funniest? Now, what Napoleon didn't know at this point was that Kutuzov did not want to risk another engagement and pulled back to Kaluga, meaning that the road to Medin was free and clear. This fateful decision was marked by both the French and the Russians. The historian Segura stated that the town on the river Lucia was the fatal field of an empire that was meant to conquer the world, whilst the Russians erected a plaque with the words "End of the offensive, start of the enemy's rout and ruin." The beginning of November is marked with temperatures dropping to somewhere between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius below zero. Men were freezing to death all over the roads and wagons were breaking down and spilling food. Those that broke down at the back were destroyed, fearing the ammunition would be scavenged by Cossacks. Starvation was rife through the ranks. Several times French soldiers would form foraging parties only to be killed by Cossacks. Men would cut open horses as they fell on the ice, slicing them up before they had actually died. There is even a report of a survivor at Berezina with 2 broken legs who survived for 2 months eating scavenged rations from bodies and sleeping under dead horses. God knows if that's true or not, but I like to think it is. Suicide was also high amongst the French troops. They knew that being left behind was a death sentence. Torture by Russian peasantry was commonplace, skinning alive, being roasted, buried alive, it's all there. Being captured by the Russians was also not ideal, as the forced marches there had a death rate of about 95% for prisoners. The reason why the raiding and capture was such a threat was that Kutuzov was moving in a parallel line to Napoleon's forces. They were still afraid of a French attack, so they just picked off the stragglers, knowing that the weather was doing the job for them. From Mozhaysk to Vyazma, nothing much really happened, except, chewing on equine drumsticks. But on the 3rd of November, the French were attacked at Vyazma. Davout and his corps, who were acting as the rearguard, were attacked and nearly encircled by the Russians, but he was rescued by Eugene. His forces broke through the encirclement, but the link to the rest of the army was threatening to collapse. Ney rescued both of them, and they all linked up with the main army in the town of Vyazma, which was set on fire to cover their retreat. About 6,000 men were killed in Davout's corps, leaving it to be a shadow of its former self. Before I talk about the Battle of Berezina, I need to talk about the events that led up to it. Now, since Moscow, Laurent Gouvion-Saint-Cyr was ordered to defend the town of Polotsk. This town was strategically important because it guarded the roads that led to the 3 supply dumps at Vitebsk, Minsk and Smolensk, and the roads that led to the rear of the Grand Armée. This hold was called the Dvina Line. He was against the Russian general Wittgenstein, and for the majority of his station, both sides held their battle lines, but on the 18th of October, the Russians were reinforced and captured the town, forcing him to retreat. Once Polotsk fell, in late October the French battled Wittgenstein twice more at Cheshniki and Smolyani in order to retake Polotsk and re-establish the Dvina Line, but these actions failed and Vitebsk was captured. On the 18th of November, a separate Russian general named Chichagov captured Minsk. The loss of these 2 supply dumps forced Napoleon to change his route north and go across the Berezina River at the crossing in Borisov. News then reached Napoleon that the Russians were close to capturing the town. The Emperor was now trapped in Russia, hemmed in by Chichagov to his west, Wittgenstein marching to the north, and Kutuzov on his trail. The only option left was to take the town of Borisov and pray to God that he wouldn't be crushed. From the 21st to the 29th of November, the final battle of the Russian campaign was fought along the banks of the Berezina River, which had thawed in an odd stretch of warm weather. Over 64,000 Russians battled 49,000 beleaguered French troopers in their final push to encircle and destroy the Grand Armée. A small contingent of 4,000 French soldiers managed to capture the town of Borisov on the first day, but they were quickly routed by Chichagov's forces. General Oudinot managed to recapture the town, but by then the bridges had burned, forcing Napoleon to search for another crossing point. Chichagov then spread out his army all over the river, scouting for French movements. Before the battle, Napoleon had actually ordered his engineers to destroy all the bridging equipment in an attempt to hasten his column, but one disobedient officer by the name of Abele managed to hide several carts. Unfortunately, he died on the 31st of the same year due to illness. I pray he got in one last snug to nappy before he passed. On the 24th, a general by the name of Corbuneau sent Napoleon a message stating of a possible crossing at a town called Studenka, 8 miles north from Borisov. Napoleon ordered the pontoons to be built at this town. The engineers barely had enough of the bridges and had to resort to taking material from the town's buildings. Due to the lack of supplies, only 2 pontoons were built, one for infantry and one for artillery. On the 25th, Napoleon put into effect his plans to divert the Russians away from the engineers, as the Russians were stationed at the town of Brilly, which was way too close to Studenka. Oudinot would draw Chichagov to the south at Ukholody, Cloud Victor, a corps commander, was to delay Wittgenstein to the north, and Corbuneau would clear the remaining scouts at Brilly. The plan was actually pretty successful, and Corbuneau encountered almost no resistance at the town. The bridges were built on the 26th. Through this and the next day, the French moved across the bridges and set up defensive lines outside Studenka, and by the end of the 27th, Victor was the last one left on the east bank, fighting the beginning lines of Wittgenstein's army. Although Kutuzov tried to improve his marching speed, he never actually made it to the battlefield, so the additional western pressure could have changed the outcome considerably. The 28th was the hardest part of the fighting. Chichagov finally realized he had been tricked, and at 6 AM he then attacked the west bank in full force. They made good progress, but a large cavalry charge from the French at noon knocked the wind out of Chichagov. The fighting continued until the end of the evening, but the Russians were too exhausted to do their final push. On the east bank, Victor battled Wittgenstein while trying to get across the bridge. Victor had it rough in this section of the fight, the main reasons being the pressure on his left and a particularly super general by the name of Partuno. This guy was stationed at Borisov as a rearguard. When he was ordered to fall back at the call to retreat, the guy went the wrong way and the entire division was captured by Cossacks. Under the threat of his last corps being cut off, Napoleon ordered an extra division to help Victor. This relieved the pressure, allowing Victor to begin his retreat. The Russians then opened fire with their artillery, breaking the artillery bridge. In the ensuing panic, thousands of troops died as they pushed and shoved each other into the freezing waters. Napoleon set up his grand battery and opened fire, allowing the last of Victor's soldiers to cross and the bridges to be burned. Those that were left behind could only watch in dismay as Napoleon left the Russians behind him. The Battle of Berezina. I've been mispronouncing Berezina the entire time. Can't be bothered to re-record. It was a miraculous escape. 49,000 French fought 64,000 Russians. It would have been over 100,000 if Kutuzov arrived. Stragglers murked the numbers, but best estimates place French losses at just over 15,000, stragglers at 10,000, and the Russians at 8,000. Approximately only 35,000 French crossed the bridges. That's basically it. The Russians left the French to the weather and Cossacks after Berezina. Napoleon declared defeat on the 3rd in his 29th bulletin and left for Paris, leaving the rest of his army under Murat to head for Vilna. Before they reached the town, most of the stragglers died to weather of such severity that thus far had not been encountered during the campaign. The soldiers arrived at Vilna when they discovered the vast amounts of supplies, more of them dying to each other and themselves. They left Vilna on the 9th of December, 20,000 men being left inside of its hospitals. On the 24th of June, 1812, 650,000 French soldiers crossed the Niemen River, following Napoleon in his hopes to destroy the Russian army. On the 14th of December, only 10,000 of them were given the opportunity to limp back to France. But all was not lost. The health of His Majesty had never been better.